The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 1878, and Rebecca Emerson held it in trembling hands as she stood in the parlor of her boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, reading words that made her world tilt sideways. Thomas Marlowe deceased. Shooting incident, Fort Kearny, Nebraska. Body requires identification. Arrive soonest. She read it 3 times before the paper slipped from her fingers to the floor. Thomas. Her Thomas, though he had never truly been hers, not in the way she had dreamed during those long months of correspondence. They had been betrothed by arrangement, their families deciding that a union between the Emersons of St. Louis and the Marlowes, who had cattle interests stretching across 3 territories, would be advantageous for everyone involved. Rebecca had never met Thomas in person, only knew him through carefully written letters that arrived every few weeks, his handwriting bold and confident, telling her about ranch life and the open plains and the freedom of the West. She had turned 21 just last month, and their wedding had been planned for June. Now she would be making the journey to Nebraska not as a bride but as a mourner, to identify a dead man and bring him home for burial. The train ride took 2 days, the landscape changing from the familiar streets and buildings of St. Louis to endless rolling prairie, dotted with settlements that grew smaller and more isolated the further west she traveled. Rebecca sat by the window in her black traveling dress, a hastily assembled mourning outfit that her landlady had helped her put together. She watched the land slide by and tried to reconcile the idea that somewhere out in this vast territory, Thomas Marlowe lay dead. She had brought all his letters with her, tied with a ribbon in her traveling bag. Sometimes she would take them out and read passages, trying to find some clue, some warning of what had happened. But there was nothing except optimism and plans for the future. In his last letter, received just 2 weeks ago, he had written about preparing the ranch house for her arrival, adding a room that would serve as her private sitting area where she could read and sew in peace. Fort Kearny appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western plains. The settlement clustered around the Platte River like a gathering of determined survivors. It was larger than she expected, with a main street lined with businesses, a church steeple rising above the other buildings, and houses spreading outward in all directions. The fort itself, which had given the town its name, sat at the edge of the settlement, though it was no longer the military installation it had once been. Rebecca stepped down from the train onto the wooden platform, her legs unsteady after so many hours of travel. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, with hints of dust and grass and something else she could not quite name. The wind was constant, tugging at her skirts and the black veil she had pinned to her hat. "Miss Emerson," a man approached her, older, with gray in his beard and kind eyes. He removed his hat respectfully. "I am Sheriff Daniel Cooper. I am deeply sorry for your loss." She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. He collected her trunk and led her to a waiting wagon, helping her up onto the seat before climbing up himself. As they rolled through the streets of Fort Kearny, he explained what he knew. It happened 3 nights ago at the Golden Eagle Saloon. There was a card game and things got heated. Shots were fired. A man went down. Several witnesses identified him as Thomas Marlowe from the Circle M Ranch. "The body is at the undertaker's establishment. I know this is difficult, but we need a formal identification before we can proceed with arrangements." Rebecca's hands twisted in her lap. "Do you know who shot him?" The shooter fled. "We are still investigating." The sheriff's voice was gentle but professional. "The witnesses we have questioned so far have given conflicting accounts. Some say it was self-defense. Others claim it was murder. Without a clear identification and more evidence, it is difficult to proceed." They stopped in front of a modest building with a sign that read Carmichael and Sons, undertaking services. Rebecca felt her stomach clench. This was real. She was about to see Thomas Marlowe's body, a man she had never met in life but had agreed to marry. The sheriff helped her down and opened the door, ushering her into a dim, cool interior that smelled of wood and chemicals and flowers trying to mask something darker underneath. A thin man in a black suit appeared from a back room, his expression appropriately somber. "Miss Emerson has arrived," the sheriff said. The undertaker nodded. "This way, please." Rebecca followed on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. They passed through a curtain into a back room where several bodies lay on tables, all covered with white sheets. The undertaker led her to one near the far wall. "I must warn you, miss, he was shot in the chest. The wounds are significant." She nodded, bracing herself. The undertaker pulled back the sheet. Rebecca looked down at the face of the dead man and felt confusion rush through her. She had only ever seen one photograph of Thomas Marlowe, a formal portrait he had sent her 6 months ago. The man on the table had similar features, the same general build, but something was wrong. The nose was slightly different, the jaw not quite the same. She leaned closer, studying the face despite the unpleasantness of it. "I need to see his hands," she said suddenly. The undertaker exchanged a glance with the sheriff but pulled the sheet down further. Rebecca looked at the hands, rough and calloused as she would expect from a rancher, but the left hand was wrong. Thomas had written to her about an accident when he was 12, when he had caught his left hand in some machinery and lost the tip of his ring finger. This man's left hand was intact, all fingers complete. "This is not Thomas Marlowe," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The sheriff stepped forward. "Miss Emerson, I understand this is shocking, but several people identified him. This man has all his fingers," she interrupted, pointing. "Thomas lost part of his ring finger as a boy. He wrote to me about it, and the face is similar but not the same. This is not the man I was engaged to marry." The room fell silent. The undertaker covered the body again, looking disturbed. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, thinking, "Are you certain?" he asked. "Completely certain." "Then we have a significant problem," the sheriff said. "Because if this is not Thomas Marlowe, then who is this man, and where is the real Thomas Marlowe?" Rebecca's mind was racing. "You said this happened at the Golden Eagle Saloon, that witnesses identified him as Thomas." "That is correct." "Then either they were mistaken or someone wanted people to think Thomas Marlowe was dead." She looked at the sheriff directly. "I need to go to the Circle M Ranch. If Thomas is alive, that is where he would be." The sheriff considered this. "The ranch is about 8 miles northwest of town." "It is getting late. Perhaps you should rest tonight at the hotel and we can ride out in the morning." But Rebecca was already moving toward the door. "Sheriff, if someone staged Thomas's death, then his life may be in danger. Every hour we wait could matter." He could see there would be no dissuading her. "Very well. I will arrange for horses and a guide, but we leave immediately." 20 minutes later, Rebecca found herself on horseback for the first time in years, wearing a borrowed riding skirt and following the sheriff, and a young deputy named James through the gathering dusk. The prairie stretched around them in all directions, the grass turning golden in the fading light. She had ridden as a girl, but never like this, never across open country with the wind in her face and the sky going purple overhead. They rode in silence mostly, the horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm. As full darkness fell, the moon rose, nearly full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Rebecca's initial burst of certainty began to waver. What if she was wrong? What if grief and hope were making her see things that were not there? But no, she thought of those hands, those intact fingers, and she knew she was right. The Circle M Ranch appeared as a cluster of lights in the darkness, lanterns glowing in windows of the main house and the bunkhouse beyond. As they rode closer, Rebecca could make out the shapes of barns and corrals, the whole operation larger and more substantial than she had imagined from Thomas's modest descriptions in his letters. They dismounted in front of the main house, and the sheriff knocked firmly on the door. There was movement inside, footsteps, and then the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and a face that might have been carved from prairie stone. "Sheriff Cooper," she said, her voice neutral, "this is unexpected. Mrs. Harriet Marlowe, I presume," the sheriff said. "I apologize for the late hour. This is Miss Rebecca Emerson from St. Louis. There has been a development regarding the death reported in town." The woman's eyes flicked to Rebecca, something sharp and assessing in her gaze. "What kind of development?" "The kind that requires us to speak with Thomas Marlowe," Rebecca said, stepping forward. "Is he here?" For a moment, Harriet Marlowe's face remained impassive. Then something shifted, a crack in the facade. "I do not know what you are talking about. My nephew is dead. We received word from town." "The man in town is not Thomas Marlowe," Rebecca said firmly. "I examined the body. Your nephew had a distinctive injury to his left hand. The dead man does not. Either you are unaware that Thomas is alive or you are protecting him. Either way, I need to see him." The older woman stared at Rebecca for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it held a grudging respect. "You are sharper than I expected from your letters. Thomas said you were intelligent, but I thought he was just being infatuated." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "You had better come in." The house was comfortable but not ostentatious, decorated with furniture that looked well made and well used. Harriet led them through to a sitting room where a fire burned low in the hearth. She poured whiskey for the sheriff and the deputy, offered Rebecca tea which she declined, and then sat down with her own glass. "3 nights ago, someone tried to kill Thomas," Harriet said without preamble. "He was in town, playing cards at the Golden Eagle like he does sometimes. A man came in, someone Thomas had never seen before, and started a fight. Drew on him. Thomas is fast, but this man was faster. Or would have been, except another player at the table, a drifter named Jack Carson, threw himself in the way. Took the bullet meant for Thomas. By the time the smoke cleared, the shooter was gone and Carson was dying." She took a sip of her whiskey. "Carson looked enough like Thomas, same height, same build, similar coloring, and he was wearing one of Thomas's jackets, borrowed it earlier in the day when his own got torn. The people in the saloon, most of them half drunk, saw what they expected to see. Someone shouted that Thomas Marlowe was shot, and that became the story. By the time Thomas got Carson outside, the man was fading fast. With his last breath, he told Thomas to let people think he was dead, that whoever hired the shooter would try again if they knew they had failed." Rebecca leaned forward. "Why would someone want Thomas dead?" "That is what we have been trying to figure out," Harriet said. "Thomas has enemies, same as any successful rancher. Water rights disputes, cattle rustling accusations, the usual, but this felt different, more deliberate, more professional." "Where is he now?" the sheriff asked. Harriet hesitated, then stood. "Come with me." She led them through the house and out a back door, across a yard to what looked like a storage building. She knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. The door opened from the inside, and a man stood framed in lantern light. Rebecca's breath caught. This was Thomas Marlowe. She knew it immediately. Taller than she had imagined, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were startlingly blue even in the dim light. He had a few days' worth of beard and looked tired, but there was something in his face, in the way he held himself, that matched the voice in his letters. His gaze moved from Harriet to the sheriff to Rebecca, and when their eyes met, something happened that Rebecca could not quite name. It was like recognition, but deeper than that, like finding something she had not known she was looking for. "Thomas," Harriet said, "this is Rebecca Emerson." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. "You came," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They told you I was dead, and you came anyway." "I came to identify a body and bring you home," Rebecca said, finding her voice shaky. "But the body was not yours." "No," he agreed. "Jack Carson died in my place, a better man than I deserve to have that fate." "We need to figure out who wants you dead," the sheriff interjected. "And we need to do it before they realize their mistake." Thomas nodded, but his attention was still on Rebecca. "I have been waiting for you," he said quietly. "Not like this, not under these circumstances. But in my letters, I told you about this place, about the life we could have here. I meant every word. And then someone tried to kill me, and I thought I would never get the chance to meet you, to see if the woman I had been writing to was as remarkable in person as she was on paper." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am here now, and I am not leaving until we sort this out." Over the next hour, sitting in that storage building with lanterns casting dancing shadows on the walls, they pieced together what they knew. Thomas explained that he had inherited the Circle M from his uncle 2 years ago, when he was 23. The ranch had been struggling, but he had turned it around through hard work and smart decisions. In the process, he had made competitors unhappy. The most obvious suspect was Vernon Blackthorne, who owned the neighboring ranch and had been trying to buy the Circle MTKS water rights for years. Then, there was Marcus Drummond, a cattle buyer in Omaha who Thomas had cut ties with after discovering the man was cheating on weights. And there were a few smaller players, men who had grudges or grievances, but none of it felt quite right. As Thomas talked, Rebecca watched him, studying the way his hands moved when he was thinking, the way his eyes focused when he was working through a problem. This was the man she had agreed to marry, and she was surprised to realize that she wanted to know him, not because of family arrangements or business interests, but because of who he was. "We need to draw them out," the sheriff said finally. "Whoever hired that shooter will be watching, waiting to confirm Thomas is dead. When they realize he is not, they will either run or try again. We need to control the situation." Thomas shook his head. "I will not put anyone else at risk. Jack died for me. That is enough." "You do not have a choice," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Someone wants you dead, and hiding in a storage building is not a solution. We need to be smart about this, but we need to act." He looked at her with something like wonder. "You have been here less than 3 hours, and you are already taking charge." "Someone needs to," she replied. "You men are all focused on pride and enemies. Start thinking about motives. Who benefits most from your death?" That question hung in the air. Thomas frowned, considering. "The ranch would go to Harriet, but she has her own money. She does not need this." "What about debts?" Rebecca asked. "Did you owe anyone money?" "Nothing significant. I paid off my uncle's debts when I took over. Business partners. I operate alone, mostly. Harriet helps with the books, and I have a foreman and about a dozen hands, but no partners." Rebecca tapped her fingers on her knee, thinking. "What about your uncle? How did he die?" Thomas blinked. "Natural causes. He had a bad heart. The doctors said it could go at any time, and it did." "But what if it was not natural?" Rebecca pressed. "What if someone has been working toward this for longer than you realize?" The room went very quiet. Harriet stood up abruptly. "You are suggesting someone murdered my husband 2 years ago." "I am suggesting we should consider every possibility," Rebecca said. "Who stood to gain from his death?" Thomas ran his hands through his hair. "I did. I inherited everything." But you did not know that would happen, Rebecca said, did you? No, my uncle and I were not particularly close. I was working on a ranch in Wyoming when I got word. I was shocked he left everything to me. Was there a will? The sheriff asked. Yes, drawn up a few months before he died. Who else knew about it? Thomas shook his head. I do not know. The lawyer, obviously, Harriet. Anyone my uncle might have told. We need to talk to that lawyer, Rebecca said. Tomorrow, the sheriff nodded. Agreed. But for tonight, we need to keep Thomas hidden and figure out sleeping arrangements. Harriet looked at Rebecca. You will stay here, of course. We have a guest room prepared. It was meant to be yours after the wedding anyway. The words hit Rebecca strangely. The wedding that was supposed to happen in 2 months, joining her life to a man she had never met. Now that man was standing 10 feet away, alive and real and looking at her like she was something precious and unexpected. Thank you, she said. That would be appreciated. Thomas stepped closer, and Rebecca caught the scent of him, leather and soap and something that was distinctly him. I am sorry, he said quietly. This is not how I wanted us to meet. I wanted to court you properly, show you the ranch in daylight, take time to let you get to know me. We have time, Rebecca said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Once we figure out who is trying to kill you. He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his tired face. You are not what I expected. Neither are you, she admitted. They stood there for a moment, the others in the room fading into background, and Rebecca felt that same strange sense of recognition. Like she had been traveling toward this moment her whole life, the spell broke when the sheriff cleared his throat. We should all get some rest. Long day tomorrow. Thomas returned to his hiding place, though he extracted a promise from the sheriff to post the deputy outside, just in case. Harriet led Rebecca back to the house and up to a bedroom that was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt and windows that looked out over the dark prairie. He has been impossible since he got your first letter, Harriet said as she lit a lamp. Checking the mail every day, grinning at nothing. I thought he was being foolish, getting attached to someone he had never met. But maybe I was wrong. Rebecca set down her bag. I do not know what I expected when I agreed to this arrangement. My parents saw it as a good opportunity. I saw it as a chance for a different life than the one I had in St. Louis, but I never expected to feel. She trailed off, not sure how to finish. Connected, Harriet supplied. That is how my husband and I were. Met once before our wedding, talked for maybe an hour, and I knew. Everyone thought I was crazy, but I knew. Her voice softened. Thomas is a good man, stubborn, sometimes too proud, but good. He will make you happy if you let him. First we need to keep him alive, Rebecca said. Harriet nodded. First we keep him alive. Rebecca did not sleep much that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch, so different from the city noises she was used to. Somewhere a horse whinnied. The wind rattled the windows. And she thought about Thomas Marlowe, hiding in a storage building, waiting for whoever wanted him dead to make their next move. Morning came with brilliant sunshine streaming through the windows. Rebecca dressed quickly in one of her traveling outfits and went downstairs to find Harriet already in the kitchen, making breakfast with the help of a young woman she introduced as Maria, who helped with the house. The sheriff left early, going back to town to start investigating, Harriet said, handing Rebecca a cup of coffee. Thomas is still in the storage building. I will take him breakfast soon. I will do it, Rebecca said, if that is all right. Harriet gave her a knowing look, but just handed her a covered plate and pointed the way. Rebecca crossed the yard in the morning light, really seeing the ranch for the first time. It was beautiful in a stark, practical way. Everything had a purpose, from the solid barns to the network of corrals to the windmill spinning in the constant breeze. In the distance, She could see cattle dotting the grasslands, hundreds of them. She knocked on the storage building door in the pattern Harriet had used. Thomas opened it almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. "I brought breakfast," Rebecca said. He stepped back to let her in. The storage building had been converted into a rough living space, with a bedroll in one corner and a few personal items scattered around. It was cramped and uncomfortable, nothing like the main house. Thomas took the plate with obvious gratitude. "I have been up since dawn, going over everything in my mind, trying to figure out who would want me dead and why." Rebecca sat down on a crate, watching him eat. "Tell me about when you inherited the ranch. What happened exactly?" Thomas chewed thoughtfully before answering. "I was working on the Morrison Ranch up in Wyoming, been there about 2 years. Good job, decent pay, learning the business. Then one day I got a telegram saying my uncle had died, and I needed to come to Nebraska for the reading of the will. I rode down, figuring he might have left me something small, maybe a few head of cattle or some personal items. Instead, the lawyer man named Preston Wolf tells me I have inherited the entire Circle M, everything. The land, the cattle, the house, all of it. How did Harriet react? She was fine with it, said she had her own money from her family and that she and my uncle had discussed it before. She wanted to stay on and help run the place, and I was grateful for that because I did not know the first thing about managing a ranch this size. And the will was legal. No one contested it. No one. I mean, there were a few distant cousins who might have had a claim, but none of them came forward." Rebecca considered this. "What about the ranch's financial situation? Was it profitable?" Thomas nodded. "Surprisingly so. My uncle had made some smart investments, owned the water rights to a crucial stretch of the Platte River, had good breeding stock. The first year I just tried not to ruin anything. Second year, I started making improvements. That is when I started making enemies. Like Vernon Blackthorne. Like Vernon, yes, and others. I refused to sell water rights, undercut some prices at market, fired a few hands who were not pulling their weight. Normal business, but people get resentful. Resentful enough to kill." Thomas set down his empty plate. "I keep coming back to that question. And the answer is, I do not know. Vernon Blackthorne is ruthless, but he is also smart. Murder is messy and draws attention. Same with Marcus Drummond. They are businessmen, not killers." "Maybe they hired someone," Rebecca suggested. "Someone professional." "That shooter in the saloon was definitely professional," Thomas agreed. "The way he moved, the way he drew, that was someone with experience." They sat in silence for a moment. Rebecca found herself very aware of the small space of Thomas sitting just a few feet away from her. In the morning light streaming through a gap in the wall, she could see his features more clearly. He was handsome, certainly, but it was more than that. There was intelligence in his eyes and kindness and a weariness that she recognized from her own reflection. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Thomas asked suddenly. "When your parents proposed the arrangement, you could have said no." Rebecca met his eyes. "I could ask you the same question. I asked first." She smiled slightly. "Fair enough. The truth is, I wanted something different. My life in St. Louis was comfortable but small. Same people, same conversations, same future stretching ahead of me predictably. When the arrangement was proposed, it felt like an adventure, a chance to be part of something bigger. And now that you are here. Now that I am here, I am trying to keep you from being murdered, so I have not had much time to evaluate my life choices," she said dryly. He laughed at that, a real laugh that filled the small space. "Fair point. For what it is worth, I agreed because I was tired of being alone. Running this ranch is rewarding, but it is also isolating. And Harriet, bless her, kept pushing me to settle down, have a family, stop living like a hermit. When she suggested the arrangement, showed me your picture, told me about your family. It seemed like it could work." "Very romantic," Rebecca said, but she was smiling. "I never expected to care about you before we even met," Thomas continued, his voice growing serious. "But your letters, the way you wrote about things, the questions you asked, your sense of humor. I started looking forward to mail day like a kid at Christmas. Started imagining what it would be like to have you here, to show you the ranch, to hear your voice instead of just reading your words." Rebecca felt her heart beating faster. "I looked forward to your letters too. They were the most interesting part of my weeks. And now you are the most interesting part of my day," she said honestly, "even if you are hiding in a storage building." He stood up and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "Rebecca, I know this is not how it was supposed to happen. We were supposed to have time to court properly, to get to know each other slowly. But circumstances being what they are, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I am very glad you came. Even with everything that is happening, even with the danger and the uncertainty, I am glad you are here." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers brushing his bearded jaw. "I am glad I came too." They stayed like that for a moment, and Rebecca thought he might kiss her. She found herself wanting him to. But then the moment was broken by the sound of horses approaching fast. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the small window. 3 riders coming in hard. Rebecca joined him, peering out. She recognized the deputy who had ridden with them last night, along with the sheriff and another man she did not know. They hurried outside as the riders dismounted. The sheriff's face was grim. "We have a problem," he said. "Preston Wolfe, the lawyer who handled your uncle's will, is dead. Killed sometime last night. Someone shot him in his office and set fire to the building. By the time the fire was put out, most of his records were destroyed." Thomas went very still. "Preston is dead. I am sorry. I know you two were friendly." "This is connected," Rebecca said. "It has to be. First they try to kill Thomas, and when that fails, they kill the one man who might have information about the inheritance." "That is what I am thinking," the sheriff agreed. "Which means whoever is behind this is getting desperate and sloppy. Desperate people make mistakes. Or they get more dangerous," Thomas said quietly. The third rider, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "I am John Turner, federal marshal out of Omaha. Sheriff Cooper sent word to me yesterday about the situation. A murder made to look like someone else's death is federal jurisdiction, especially when it might involve fraud or conspiracy related to property inheritance." Thomas shook his head. "This is getting bigger than it should be." "That is because someone is willing to kill to get what they want," Marshal Turner said. "We need to figure out what that is, and fast, before anyone else dies." They reconvened in the main house, spreading out in the large dining room. Harriet joined them, her face pale when she heard about Preston Wolfe's death. "Preston was a good man," she said softly. "He handled my husband's affairs for 20 years. I cannot imagine anyone wanting to hurt him." "Unless he knew something," Marshal Turner said. "Something about the inheritance or the will that someone wanted to keep hidden." "The will was straightforward," Harriet said. "Everything to Thomas, with a provision that I could stay on the ranch as long as I wished. Preston read it to us both, and we both signed as witnesses along with his clerk. There was nothing unusual about it." "Who was the clerk?" Rebecca asked. Harriet thought for a moment. "A young man named Samuel something. He did not work for Preston long, maybe 6 months. Left town shortly after my husband died." The marshal and sheriff exchanged looks. "We need to find this Samuel," the sheriff said. "I might know where to start looking," the third man said, "but it will take time." "Time is something we do not have much of," Thomas said. He had been pacing the room, restless energy coming off him in waves. Someone is tying up loose ends. Preston is dead, his records are destroyed. If they think I am still alive, I am next on the list. Not if we get to them first, Rebecca said. She turned to the marshal. What if we set a trap? Everyone looked at her. She felt Thomas's eyes on her, especially equal parts impressed and concerned. What kind of trap? The marshal asked. Rebecca's mind was working fast, pieces falling together. We know they want Thomas dead. We know they are watching. What if we give them what they think they want, but on our terms? Thomas shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. I am not putting you or anyone else in danger. You do not have a choice, Rebecca said firmly. Right now, you are hiding, they are hunting, and innocent people like Preston Wolfe are dying. We need to change the dynamic, make them react to us instead of the other way around. She has a point, the marshal said slowly. If we stage something public, something that draws them out, we might be able to identify who is behind this and catch them in the act. They spent the next 2 hours hammering out a plan. It was risky, with multiple points where things could go wrong, but it was better than waiting for the next attack. The key was to make it believable while minimizing actual danger. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Thomas and Rebecca stood on the porch of the main house, watching the sky turn orange and purple. I do not like this plan, Thomas said for probably the 10th time. I know, but it is the best option we have. If anything happens to you, it will not, Rebecca interrupted, because you will be there and the marshal will be there and the sheriff and his deputies. We have thought through every angle. Thomas turned to face her fully. Rebecca, we have known each other for less than a day in person. But I feel like I have known you for months. Your letters, they gave me hope when I did not realize I needed it. And now you are here, and you are brilliant and brave and everything I imagined and more. The thought of you being in danger because of me is unbearable. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. Then we make sure the plan works. We catch whoever is doing this, and then we have the rest of our lives to get to know each other properly. Promise me, he said, taking her hands in his. Promise me you will be careful. I promise, if you promise the same. Deal. He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her, and Rebecca leaned into his chest, hearing his heartbeat strong and steady. They stood like that as the stars began to appear overhead, and despite everything, Rebecca felt safe. The next morning, the plan went into motion. Word was quietly spread through town that Thomas Marlowe had been spotted alive, that there had been a mistake in the identification, and that he would be at the Golden Eagle Saloon that evening to set the record straight and honor the memory of Jack Carson, the man who had actually died. It was the kind of story that would spread fast, designed to draw out whoever had hired the shooter. The marshal and his men would be positioned throughout the saloon and the surrounding buildings. Thomas would be there, but wearing a specially made vest under his shirt that could stop most bullets. Rebecca had insisted on being present too, over Thomas's objections, claiming that, as his fiancée, her absence would be suspicious. The day crawled by slowly. Rebecca spent most of it with Harriet, learning about the ranch and trying to keep her mind off what was coming. Harriet showed her the account books, explaining how the operation worked, the seasonal rhythms of cattle ranching, the business relationships that kept everything running. You have a good head for this, Harriet observed as Rebecca asked detailed questions about water rights and grazing rotation. Thomas will need that. Running this place is more than just riding around on a horse looking rugged. Rebecca laughed. I think I can manage more than that. I think you can too, Harriet said warmly. I was not sure about this arrangement at first, seemed old-fashioned even for us. But seeing you two together, even in these circumstances, I think it might work out after all. If we survive the next few hours, Rebecca said. There is that, Harriet agreed. As afternoon turned to evening, Rebecca changed into one of her nicer dresses, a deep green that brought out her eyes. She arranged her dark hair carefully and tried to calm her racing heart. When she came downstairs, Thomas was waiting, dressed in his best clothes, looking every inch the successful rancher. The protective vest was hidden under his white shirt and vest. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look terrified," she replied. "That is because I am." He offered his arm. "But let us go catch a killer anyway." They rode into Fort Kearney as the sun was setting, just the two of them in a buggy, though Rebecca knew the marshal and his men were already in position. The main street was busy with evening traffic, people finishing their business before dark. The Golden Eagle Saloon was lit up, music and voices spilling out into the street. Thomas helped Rebecca down from the buggy, and they stood for a moment, looking at the entrance. "Last chance to change your mind," he said. "Not a chance," she replied. They walked in together. The saloon fell silent as people recognized Thomas. The bartender's eyes went wide. A few men stood up from their tables. The piano player's hands stilled on the keys. "Evening, everyone," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the room. "I hear there has been some confusion about my death. As you can see, the reports were exaggerated." A murmur ran through the crowd. Rebecca stayed close to Thomas's side, her eyes scanning the room, looking for anything suspicious. She spotted the marshal in a corner, dressed as a cowhand, and the sheriff near the bar, playing the role of a curious citizen. Thomas walked to the center of the room. "The man who died here 3 nights ago was Jack Carson. He saved my life, took a bullet meant for me. I am here tonight to honor his memory and to let whoever hired that shooter know that they failed." The room stayed tense. Rebecca could feel the attention on them, could sense the danger lurking somewhere in the crowd. Her hand stayed on Thomas's arm, ready to pull him down if shooting started. "I am also here," Thomas continued, "to make an announcement. This is Miss Rebecca Emerson, my fiancée from St. Louis. She came all the way here thinking I was dead, ready to identify my body and take me home. Instead, she found me alive, and she has agreed to stay and become my wife. So whoever is trying to destroy what I have built here should know that I am not going anywhere, and neither is she." Rebecca had not expected that addition to the plan, but she played along, smiling up at Thomas with what she hoped looked like devotion. It was not hard to fake, she realized. Despite the fear and the danger, despite knowing him for such a short time, she found herself caring deeply about what happened to him. "That is very touching," a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. A man stood there, well-dressed, middle-aged, with cold eyes and a confident stance. He was flanked by 2 rough-looking men who had the unmistakable air of hired guns. "Vernon Blackthorne," Thomas said quietly. "I should have known." "Should you?" Vernon stepped into the room, his men following. The crowd melted away from them, leaving a clear space. "I have been very careful, Thomas, very patient, but you are right, it is time to end this." "You killed my uncle," Thomas said, not a question. Vernon smiled. "Proved nothing, of course. A man with a bad heart takes some doctored medicine and nature takes its course. Easy, quiet. And then I arranged for that fool Preston to draw up a new will, leaving everything to you, dear Thomas, the unknown nephew from Wyoming. Young, inexperienced, easy to manipulate or drive out." "Except I was not," Thomas said. "No, you were not," Vernon agreed, his smile fading. "You were surprisingly competent. Refused to sell me the water rights, improved the operation, made yourself a fixture here. I tried patience. I tried intimidation. Finally, I decided it was easier to just remove you and buy the ranch from your grief-stricken aunt." Harriet's sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. Rebecca had not known she followed them into town. "You will not get away with this," the marshal said, stepping forward, his badge now visible. "You just confessed to murder in front of 30 witnesses." Vernon laughed. "Did I? I am just an old man telling stories, nothing that would hold up in court." His hand moved toward his gun. "But I think I am done talking." Everything happened very fast. Vernon's men drew their weapons. Thomas shoved Rebecca behind him. Gunfire erupted. Rebecca hit the floor, her ears ringing from the noise. She saw Thomas drop, could not tell if he was shot or diving for cover. The marshal and the sheriff were returning fire, other men in the crowd pulling their own weapons. It was chaos, exactly what they had tried to avoid. Rebecca crawled toward where Thomas had fallen, her heart in her throat. She found him behind an overturned table, very much alive, his own gun drawn and firing at Vernon's men. One of the hired guns was down, the other pinned behind the bar. Vernon himself had taken cover near the door. "Stay down," Thomas shouted at her over the noise. "Not a chance," she shouted back. More men poured into the saloon, deputies the marshal had stationed outside. Vernon saw he was outnumbered and made a break for the door. The marshal tackled him before he made it 2 steps, slamming him to the ground and pinning his arms behind his back. The remaining hired gun threw down his weapon and raised his hands. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the saloon filled with gun smoke and the ringing echo of violence. Thomas pulled Rebecca to her feet, his hands frantically checking her for injuries. "Are you hit? Are you hurt?" "I am fine," she gasped. "Are you?" "The vest stopped 2 bullets," he said, his voice shaky. "I am going to have bruises, but I am fine." They held each other as the marshal and sheriff secured Vernon and his remaining man. Around them, people were checking for injuries, righting furniture, exclaiming about what had just happened. Vernon was forced to his knees, his face purple with rage. "You have nothing," he snarled. "A confession made under duress is not admissible. Any lawyer will have me out by morning." "Maybe," the marshal said calmly, "but we also have Samuel Preston, the clerk who witnessed the fake will. Found him in Omaha yesterday. He is very willing to testify about how you paid him to forge documents and help you poison Thomas's uncle. We have the shooter you hired, caught trying to leave town this morning, and he is already talking to save his own neck. And we have 30 witnesses who just heard you confess to murder. So you are done, Vernon, finally done." The fight went out of Vernon then, his shoulders slumping. He was hauled to his feet and dragged out of the saloon, his hired man following. The crowd watched in silence, and then slowly, people began to cheer. Thomas Marlowe had been under threat for months without even knowing it, and now the threat was ended. Thomas pulled Rebecca outside into the cool night air, away from the noise and the crowd. They stood in the street, and Rebecca realized she was shaking. "It is over," Thomas said, his arms coming around her. "It is finally over. He killed your uncle," Rebecca said, "plotted all of this for years." "If I had not come, if I had not noticed that the body was not yours—" "But you did," Thomas interrupted. "You noticed, you questioned. You refused to accept what everyone else believed. You saved my life, Rebecca." She looked up at him. "We saved each other." And then he was kissing her, right there in the middle of the street with half the town watching. Rebecca kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, feeling the solid reality of him, alive and safe in hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of an arrangement or because our families think it is a good idea. Marry me because in 2 days you have become the most important person in my world. Marry me because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "Yes," Rebecca said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Vernon Blackthorne was tried and convicted of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to hang. His ranch and assets were seized to pay restitution to Thomas and Harriet. The water rights dispute that had been simmering for years was resolved in the Circle MTK's favor. Rebecca sent word to her family in St. Louis, explaining everything that had happened. Her mother wrote back with concern and congratulations in equal measure, giving her blessing to the marriage and promising to send Rebecca's belongings west. The wedding was planned for mid-June, giving Rebecca time to settle into her new life and get to know Thomas properly. They spent their days working together on the ranch, Thomas teaching her to ride better, showing her the full extent of the operation. She showed him the improvements she had been thinking about for the bookkeeping system, ways to track expenses and profits more efficiently. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk for hours, sharing stories from their lives before, learning each other's quirks and habits and dreams. Thomas told her about growing up in Kansas, about the restlessness that had driven him west, about finding his place on the Circle M. Rebecca told him about St. Louis, about feeling trapped by society's expectations, about wanting more than what her life there could offer. "You miss it?" Thomas asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "Sometimes I miss the convenience," Rebecca admitted. "The shops, the restaurants, the culture, but I do not miss the life I was living there. Here I feel like I matter. What I do makes a difference to the ranch, to you, to our future. In St. Louis, I was just another young woman waiting for life to happen to her." Thomas took her hand. "You matter more than you know. This place, it runs better with you here. I run better with you here." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am glad I came to identify a dead man and found you alive instead." "Best case of mistaken identity in history," Thomas agreed. The wedding took place on a perfect June day, with blue skies and a gentle breeze that kept the heat at bay. They were married in the small church in Fort Kearney, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Harriet cried through the whole ceremony. The sheriff served as one of Thomas's groomsmen. The marshal, who had stayed in the area to finish tying up the case, attended as a guest. Rebecca wore a dress that had been her grandmother's, carefully preserved and shipped from St. Louis. Thomas wore a new suit that Harriet had insisted on buying him. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives, Rebecca felt the truth of the words in her bones. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with. The reception was held at the Golden Eagle Saloon, the scene of so much danger now transformed with decorations and music, and the best food Fort Kearney could produce. People danced and drank and celebrated long into the night. Rebecca whirled around the floor in Thomas's arms, laughing as he spun her, feeling lighter and happier than she ever had in her life. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift home, Thomas and Rebecca slipped away, riding back to the Circle M under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. They had prepared a room in the main house, a space that was now theirs, separate from the rest of the household. "Nervous?" Thomas asked as they stood on the porch looking out at their land. "A little," Rebecca admitted, "but excited too." He pulled her close, kissing her gently. "We have all the time in the world. No rush, no pressure. Just us." They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that surprised them both, learning each other's bodies the way they had been learning each other's minds and hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, talking quietly until sleep finally claimed them. The first year of their marriage was full of adjustment and growth. Rebecca threw herself into managing the household and helping with the ranch's business affairs. She discovered she had a talent for negotiation, securing better prices for their cattle and establishing new trade relationships. Thomas deferred to her judgment more and more on financial matters, recognizing that her education and sharp mind were assets the ranch had been lacking. They had their disagreements, of course. Thomas could be stubborn and prideful, reluctant to ask for help even when he needed it. Rebecca could be impatient and blunt, sometimes hurting feelings when she was just trying to be efficient. But they learned to talk through their conflicts, to listen to each other, to find compromises that honored both their needs. Harriet became not just Thomas's aunt, but Rebecca's friend and mentor. She taught Rebecca the subtler aspects of ranch life, the social dynamics of the community, the history of the land and the people who had worked it. In return, Rebecca helped Harriet modernize some of the household systems, implementing new methods for preserving food and managing supplies. In the spring of 1879, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She broke the news to Thomas one evening as they sat together in their private sitting room, the space he had built for her before they even met. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "As sure as I can be. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday." Thomas whooped and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are having a baby," he kept saying. "We are having a baby." The pregnancy was not easy. Rebecca suffered from sickness in the early months and exhaustion throughout. But Thomas was attentive and supportive, taking on more of her usual tasks and making sure she rested. Harriet fussed over her constantly, making special foods and insisting on the best care available. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1880, arriving early and in a hurry, just like his mother. They named him James Thomas Marlowe, James after Jack Carson, whose middle name it had been, the man who had died so Thomas could live. He was a healthy, loud baby with a good set of lungs and his father's blue eyes. Thomas was immediately and completely smitten, holding his son with a gentleness that made Rebecca's heart ache. She would find him sometimes in the middle of the night, sitting in the rocking chair with James in his arms, just watching the baby sleep with an expression of absolute wonder. "I never knew I could feel like this," Thomas told her one of those nights. "Like my heart is walking around outside my body." "I know exactly what you mean," Rebecca said, coming to stand beside them, her hand on Thomas's shoulder as they both looked down at their sleeping child. Life settled into a new rhythm after James was born. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. They added more land, improved their breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality and fair dealing. Thomas became a respected voice in the Territorial Cattle Association. Rebecca started a lending library in Fort Kearny, donating books from her collection in St. Louis and organizing reading groups for the women in town. In 1882, their daughter was born, a tiny thing they named Clara Rose, after both their mothers. She was quieter than James had been, more thoughtful, with Rebecca's dark hair and serious eyes. James, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and show her his toys. Harriet helped with the children, delighting in her role as grandmother figure. She had never had children of her own, and she poured all her maternal instinct into James and Clara. The house that had once been quiet and orderly was now full of noise and life and occasional chaos. In 1884, Rebecca gave birth to twin boys, Samuel and Daniel. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, but mother and babies came through healthy. Thomas hired additional help for the house, insisting that Rebecca not overextend herself trying to manage everything. "We can afford it," he told her when she protested. "And I would rather have you healthy and happy than exhausted and struggling." With 4 children under the age of 5, the household was indeed chaotic. but it was a joyful chaos, full of laughter and discovery. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, making time every day to play with the children, to tell them stories, to teach them about the ranch and the land. Rebecca watched him one evening as he sat on the floor with all 4 children, building a tower out of wooden blocks that James kept knocking down, making everyone laugh. She thought about the telegram that had arrived 6 years ago, calling her to identify a dead man. She thought about the journey west, the mystery they had unraveled, the danger they had faced, and she thought about how all of it, every moment, had led to this, to a life she loved with a man she loved, surrounded by children they had created together, on land they had made their own. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, catching her watching them. "How lucky I am," she said honestly. "We both are," he replied, his eyes warm with the kind of love that had only deepened over the years. The years continued to pass. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. James, the eldest, showed an early talent for working with horses and a natural leadership ability. Clara was quiet and observant, with a gift for drawing and a deep connection to the land. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were inseparable and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief that kept Rebecca on her toes. In 1887, tragedy struck when Harriet passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68. The whole family mourned her loss deeply. She had been a constant presence in their lives, a source of wisdom and love. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the prairies she had loved. "She saw us build this life," Thomas said as they stood by her grave after the funeral, the children quiet and sad around them. "She knew we were happy. That is something." "It is everything," Rebecca agreed, taking his hand. With Harriet gone, Rebecca took over more of the household management while Thomas focused on the ranch operations. James, now 7, started helping his father with small tasks around the ranch. Clara, at 5, helped Rebecca with the younger children and showed an interest in learning to read and write. The twins, at 3, were energetic and curious about everything. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Thomas made smart investments, diversifying beyond just cattle into horses and some farming. Rebecca's business acumen helped them navigate the economic ups and downs of the late 1880s. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations and labor disputes, but they did it together, as partners. In the summer of 1890, Rebecca's parents came from St. Louis for their first visit. Her father was in poor health, and she had invited them west, knowing it might be his last chance to see his grandchildren. The visit was bittersweet, her parents aged and frail, marveling at the life Rebecca had built. "I worried when you agreed to marry a man you had never met," her mother confessed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I worried you would be unhappy, trapped in a life you did not choose." "It was the best choice I ever made," Rebecca said. "Thomas is my partner in every way, and this life, it is everything I wanted without knowing I wanted it." Her father passed away that winter, back in St. Louis. Rebecca mourned him but took comfort in knowing he had seen her happy, had met his grandchildren, had approved of the life she had chosen. Her mother followed 2 years later, and Rebecca inherited a modest sum that they used to build a new barn and expand the house. By 1895, the Circle M was one of the most successful ranches in Nebraska. James, now 15, worked full-time alongside his father, learning every aspect of the operation. Clara, at 13, showed an interest in the business side, often helping Rebecca with the books. The twins, at 11, were still wild but showing promise, particularly with horses. Thomas and Rebecca, now in their late 30s, had settled into a comfortable partnership that had only grown stronger with time. They still made time for each other, still found moments to steal away and talk or just be together. The passionate love of their early days had matured into something deeper and more enduring, a bone-deep certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. One evening in the summer of 1896, they stood on the same porch where they had stood so many times before, watching the sun set over the prairie. The children were inside, the sounds of their laughter and arguments drifting out through the open windows. "Do you remember the first time we stood here together?" Thomas asked, his arm around Rebecca's waist. "I was terrified," Rebecca admitted. "Terrified you would be killed, terrified I had made a huge mistake coming west, terrified of my own feelings for a man I barely knew. And now I am not terrified of anything except losing you," she said honestly. "You are my whole world, Thomas. You and the children and this life we have built." He pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "When I was hiding in that storage building, waiting to see if whoever wanted me dead would strike again, I kept thinking about you, about the woman I had been writing to, wondering if I would ever get to meet her. And then you walked in with that breakfast plate, and I knew. I knew you were everything I had been waiting for." "I have been waiting for you," Rebecca said softly, echoing the words he had said to her that first morning. "I just did not know it until I found you." They stood together as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over them through danger and discovery, through courtship and marriage, through the building of a family and a life. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of grass and earth and home. In 1898, James married a young woman from town, the daughter of the general store owner. The wedding was large and joyful, and within a year, Rebecca and Thomas became grandparents to a baby girl. James built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, starting his own family while still helping to run the Circle M. Clara, at 17, announced she wanted to go to college back east, to study business and agriculture. After much discussion, Thomas and Rebecca agreed, proud of their daughter's ambition even as they worried about her being so far away. She left in the fall of 1899, promising to return. The twins, now 15, were inseparable as ever, both showing a talent for horse training. They talked about starting their own breeding operation someday, and Thomas encouraged them, seeing in them the same drive and determination that had built the Circle M into what it was. As the new century approached, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She was 41 years old, mother of 4, grandmother to 1, co-owner of a successful ranch, and wife to a man she loved more with each passing year. It was not the life she had imagined growing up in St. Louis, but it was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. On the last day of 1899, the whole family gathered at the main house to celebrate the turning of the century. James and his wife were there with baby Alina. The twins were wrestling in the yard, their energy seemingly endless. Clara was home from college for the holidays, full of stories about her studies and the modern world back east. As midnight approached, they all gathered on the porch, watching the sky, waiting for the moment when the 19th century would become the 20th. Thomas stood with his arm around Rebecca, their children and grandchild around them, and Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Thomas asked softly, noticing. "Just happy," she whispered back. "So incredibly happy." The clock struck midnight and they cheered, welcoming the new century together. The children made noise and threw confetti. James held his baby daughter up to see the stars, and Clara laughed at something one of the twins said. Rebecca looked at Thomas and found him watching her with the same expression of love and wonder he had worn on their wedding day. After 18 years of marriage, after all they had been through together, that look still made her heart skip. "To the next 100 years," Thomas said, raising his glass. "To family," Rebecca added. "To love," Clara chimed in. They all drank to that, to love and family and the future stretching ahead of them. And as Rebecca looked around at the faces of the people who made up her world, she thought about the telegram that had started it all. She had come west to identify a dead man and found instead a living, breathing future full of more joy and purpose than she had ever imagined possible. The Circle M continued to thrive well into the new century. James took on more and more responsibility as Thomas began to slow down, though he never fully retired. The twins did start their own horse breeding operation, building it into a successful business that complemented the ranch. Clara returned from college with a degree and fresh ideas, implementing new management techniques that increased efficiency and profits. More grandchildren arrived over the years. James and his wife had 3 more children. One of the twins married and started a family. Even Clara, after years of claiming she was too focused on her career, fell in love with a fellow rancher and married at 28, giving Rebecca and Thomas 2 more grandchildren to dote on. Through it all, through the joys and the sorrows, the triumphs and the challenges, Thomas and Rebecca remained each other's constant. They worked together, laughed together, argued sometimes, and made up always. They watched their children become adults and their grandchildren grow. They saw the West change and evolve around them, becoming less wild but no less beautiful. In the spring of 1920, as Rebecca turned 63 and Thomas 65, they took a rare day away from the ranch to ride out to their favorite spot, a rise overlooking miles of prairie where they had often gone when they needed to think or talk or just be together. They dismounted and sat in the grass, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of knowing each other. Rebecca's hair was gray now, and Thomas had lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises, but they were still strong, still healthy, still together. "Do you ever think about that telegram?" Thomas asked suddenly. "The one that brought you here," Rebecca smiled. "Sometimes it seems like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago," Thomas said. "Our lifetime, the best lifetime I could have imagined." "Mine too," Rebecca said, leaning against his shoulder the way she had done thousands of times before. "I came to identify a dead man and found instead a living, breathing love that has sustained me through everything. Found a partner, a family, a home. Found myself, really." "I have been waiting for you," Thomas said, echoing the words he had spoken that first morning in the storage building. "And every day since I have been grateful you came." "Me too," Rebecca whispered. "Me too." They sat together on that hill as the sun climbed higher. 2 people who had started as strangers brought together by arrangement and circumstance, who had become partners and lovers and best friends. Around them, the prairie stretched endlessly, the same prairie that had witnessed their courtship and their wedding, that had watched their children grow and their love deepen. The Circle M would continue for generations after them, passed down through their children and grandchildren, a legacy of hard work and smart decisions and the partnership between a cowboy from the West and a woman from St. Louis, who had taken a chance on an arranged marriage and found true love instead. But all of that was in the future. For now, in this moment, there was just Thomas and Rebecca, sitting together on a hill under the vast Nebraska sky, still in love after all these years, still grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. She had come to identify a dead man and found him alive. He had been waiting for her, and together they had built a life worth living, a love worth having, a story worth telling. The sun warmed their faces as they sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, hearts full, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together, just as they always had. And that was everything. That was all they needed. That was love in its truest, most enduring form, born from danger and mystery, forged in partnership and respect, and sustained through all the years by choice and commitment, and the deep, abiding certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for all along.